ground powers of that day. And we have no idea, and I think this to a certain extent is deliberate on the part of our own presentations of history, but we simply have no idea of the sheer scale of operations, nor the huge, enormous casualties that Nazi Germany inflicted on the Soviet Union. Now, the bad news is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, eventually the Russians revealed the fact that their casualties might have been as much as double as previously thought.
Quite right, yes.
So we're now looking at casualty figures that may run as high as 60 to 75 million.
Yes, yeah.
And that poses some nasty historical difficulties.
Indeed, indeed. And when we come back from the break, I think that you might be able to help us connect a few of those dots about why it was that being assigned a duty station of the Eastern Front was so undesirable. And I think for a lot of our folks from watching Hogan's Heroes, you know, they knew that was not a promotion to be reassigned to the Eastern Front. But it wasn't just because of the weather. There were a lot of things happening, a lot of toys, the extensions of some of that research you spoke of earlier that were being utilized, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Farrell, if we can take just a short break,
sure.
We'll be back in just a few moments with the listening audience, and where we're about to go in the conversation, no one knows quite for sure, but I can promise you it will be fascinating. So we'll be back in just a
BBSradio.com. If it's not mainstream, it could be here. Information, knowledge, bringing humanity closer to truth. And love. BBSradio.com.
And welcome back from our break, folks. You're listening to The Crimson Pill with your host, Antonin Fiore, on BBSradio.com, station number 2. We are very privileged on The Crimson Pill today to be joined by our featured guest, Dr. Joseph Farrell. And we left off talking a little bit about the actual historical scope, the magnitude of man's inhumanity to man through the course of that conflict. And we'd left off with some of the staggering statistics, which, as you mentioned, Dr. Farrell, that these numbers continue to evolve as some of the nations involved, Russia in particular, Eastern Bloc nations, continue to release a bit more about those statistics. But what I wonder, Dr. Farrell, is if you would help us to understand a bit more about how it came to pass. Well, what were the tactics involved? What was occurring that could have resulted in these enormous casualty statistics, civilians as well as military in Russia?
Oh boy, that's the question that opens up Pandora's box, because this really is from the standpoint of conventional military operations a huge mystery, because as tactically competent as the German army was, and incidentally still is, as tactically competent as it was, and then later in the war as they were getting their newer, more advanced tank designs online and going much more to an army that was deploying almost nothing but automatic weapons and so on and so forth. As tactically competent as this made the German army, it still means you have to account for an almost 10-to-1 kill ratio, which is, anybody who studies military operations, particularly of that period, will tell you is just impossible. So this means that whatever's going on the Eastern Front, there is something else that is going on beyond the normal operational uses of World War II. In other words, they're using weapons other than tanks, bombs, artillery shells, and automatic weapons.
Yes, yes.
Now, there have always been persisting rumors, if you study the Eastern Front very carefully, there have always been persisting rumors that the Germans were indeed using some non-conventional weaponry that was the result of some of their research projects. Now, one of the things I report in Reich of the Black Sun and then again in SS Brotherhood of the Bell is that we know from the testimony of Nazi veterans themselves, people like SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny, that the Germans did use a World War II version of the fuel-air bomb. Now, we have to stop and really understand the staggering nature of that claim, because a fuel-air bomb, the fuel-air bombs that the Germans tested and had actually available at the end of the war, were capable of delivering a punch, a blast area, similar to a tactical nuclear weapon. In other words, these weapons were enormous weapons. All right? I even record in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell a test of a 1944 fuel-air weapon by the Nazis that quite literally laid all the trees flat to a distance of 12 kilometers. In other words, these are huge, huge conventional bombs. If you were to see one go off, they would almost look like a nuclear bomb. All right? Well, the Germans, according to Skorzeny, were using these things as early as December in 1941 in their assault on Moscow. And they were using them in rocket-propelled artillery batteries. Now, if you examine the type of rocket batteries the Germans were using at that time in the war, they were these 6-barreled rocket launchers, usually of 11 inches caliber, that would fire rockets, multiple rounds of rockets. So in other words, if you can imagine a battery of 6 of these things, each firing 6 rockets, then the effect of firing fuel-air bombs, you might as well say carpet bombing and tactical nukes in the same phrase.
Oh, my.
Oh, yeah, oh, my. And this is 1941. So in other words, the Germans are willing to use these types of weapons against the Russians, and I think the explanation lies in the Nazi ideology, because, as far as the Nazis were concerned, the Slavs were an inferior species. They were an inferior race. They weren't willing to use these weapons on the Western Allies until very late in the war, when they began to contemplate doing so as the military situation simply deteriorated. But there are reports, in other words, what I'm getting at is there are reports over and over and over from the Eastern Front, beginning in 1941. You hear them again in 1942, coupled with the siege of Sevastopol in the Crimea. You hear them again in 1943, coupled with the Battle of Kursk. You hear rumors of death rays being tested in 1944 as the front advances into Romania, and so on and so forth. In other words, the Nazis were using everything that they had available, and the Russians, for their part, were spending rivers of blood to push the Germans out and back.
Yes.
Now, the reason we've never heard, in my opinion, the question I always get asked is, why haven't we heard of this until now? Well, the reason why we didn't hear of it in the war, I think, was, number one, Stalin would have been loath to admit that he was facing an enemy that was using these types of weapons. The Red Army had a vast morale problem all throughout the war. So, to admit publicly that, we're facing an enemy that's using these types of weapons, that may have weakened Stalin's government to the point that it may have either been forced to surrender or to collapse. So, in other words, we are looking at, I think, with the casualty figures of the Soviet Union being so astronomical. I mean, we're talking almost a tenth of the population that was lost in that conflict to the German war machine. It would not have been won without the Russians. If we look at all of this and couple this to the stories, I think that's the answer. I think the Germans are using some of these technologies that they've researched and brought to a certain pitch of development, that they're using these technologies on the Eastern Front, and that's why it is so very bloody.
Indeed. And in fact, I think that the implementation, the use of some of these technologies, these weapons, we now know, our listening audience, the scope and the scale of the horrific proportions, the damage, the death, the genocide, being undertaken systematically by the Nazi party and of course Germany by extension.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, that some of these types of weapons that are, quasi-conventional in nature, I suppose, at the same time they were investing quite heavily in time, resource, etc., in some physics that we don't even have available to us from speculation, except for the body of your work and such. I think you'd referred to the Nazi bell research. I wonder if you could talk more about that.
The bell is kind of the main focus of my Nazi research, for a very simple reason. What we're dealing with, in my opinion, with the Bell story is we're dealing, first of all, with the real basis for the Nazi UFO legend, all right? Mm-hmm. The problem here is that with the Bell, unlike with stories of Hanabu and Vril and all of these fanciful flying saucers that you so often read about, with the Bell story, we're dealing with something very, very different. And this is the reason it's taken me 6 books, and I'm writing a 7th one right now as we speak on all of this. Because this is a story that really emerged after German reunification. And it emerged in such a fashion that you could couple the project itself to known installations, to known personnel with particular physics interest that dovetails quite nicely with this interwar unified field theory research that we mentioned in the previous segment, and dovetails quite nicely to one major physicist, a fellow by the name of Professor Dr. Walter Gerlach, who was an internationally renowned physicist. He was part of the Stern-Gerlach team, and Stern, of course, went on to win the Nobel Prize. So Gerlach is not a second stringer. But his own personal physics fascination was, number 1, gravity, number 2, magnetism and the idea of spin states of particles. He helped prove the spin state of the electron in that experiment. So in other words, this is the man who is fascinated with all of this stuff. Well, he just so happens to also be the project head of this Nazi Bell. The third thing that we have with the Bell story is we have a known set of code names for this project, and we also have indicators in the literature that I've reproduced in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and more recently in a book of mine called Roswell and the Reich, that the project itself was said to be Kriegsentscheidend. In other words, the German word here is war decisive.
War decisive.
War decisive. Yeah. Now, you have to understand the significance of that code name used in connection with this project, because this term is never used of the atom bomb. In other words, the atom bomb to them is already sort of small potatoes. Okay. And that's scary enough,
Indeed.
And you have to understand that when you say the atom bomb is small potatoes, they also saw, very clearly, they also saw the theoretical possibility of the hydrogen bomb. Well, they've already looked beyond that even, and with this project are investigating torsion physics and its uses as being a way to tap into those three uses for zero-point energy, for field propulsion, and then, of course, for the ultimate weapon. Nazis being